This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Stacey Wentworth, a board-certified radiation oncologist. I write a Substack called Cancer Culture, and I host the new podcast, Less Radical.
Amazing. So one of the reasons that we wanted to have you on the show today is that you have a new podcast out that is produced with Melody. And I feel like she's like the proud mom with like her two daughters watching us right now, you know? So we both love Melody, but I also I've heard so much about the show as it's gone through development, and it came out a couple weeks ago. So please tell us about the show.
Sure. So, of course, Melody is a visionary and really helped us bring this idea together. So the podcast is about a hidden figure. His name is Dr. Bernard Fisher. He was a Jewish surgeon from Pittsburgh who revolutionized cancer treatment and specifically breast cancer treatment. So he was the first person really to upend centuries of thought that cancer had one direction, and it was out from the cancer to the lymph nodes. And the thought at the time, and sometimes patients still ask me this today, is there's a moment in time when you can capture all the cancer cells. So up until Dr. Fisher, people thought that cancer failed because the surgery wasn't big enough. So you just didn't go big enough. So there were these radical and super radical surgeries. In breast cancer, they were talking about amputating women's arms. And if they could just figure out the direct pathway that cancer spread to their legs, that they could amputate their femurs. So it was just this surgical thought. And in those surgeons' defenses, really the only thing they had was the knife. And Dr. Fisher was a surgeon and sort of took on the medical establishment and said, hey, why don't we understand the behavior of cancer first, see what these cancer cells are doing, and then we can be less radical and more specific on our treatment. So then a very vindictive NCI director, as well as some misguided congressional hearings, took him down at the height of his career and really brought shame to him and to his legacy in a very mean-spirited way. And that experience haunted him for the rest of his life and clouded his legacy. So there's a reason nobody's heard about him, and we are so excited to be telling this story.
So I think that it's only relatively recent that people have thought of diseases as like a culture of a disease.
Yes.
I'm thinking specifically of people talking about like how dental care is cultural, how the way that we have thought about mental illness has changed with time according to the way that like mental illness is conceived within the culture at a specific moment. But I think that outside of mental illness, that there hasn't been a lot of understanding of how like afflictions of the rest of the body, like the discourse around them has shifted significantly over time. And it's really interesting to dig into how that discourse has shifted. So that seems to me to be a huge part of the work that you're doing. And also the title of your Substack is Cancer Culture. So
yes, it's a great crossover for sure. It is the culture around cancer. And I will tell you, Anne, the reason I started this podcast and the reason I started my Substack is that I've been practicing for 20 years and I heard the same things over and over from my patients. And it was this gap between what the world thinks cancer is and what the experience of cancer is. And patients who are diagnosed with cancer who either have successful treatment and go on to be cancer survivors, or are going to live and then die from cancer, or in this new wave of cancer survivors, live with cancer as a chronic disease. They really go through the looking glass, if you will, and they're living in a different reality. And they look around and say, hey, this is a lot different than I thought. But trying to explain, I had one patient who explained to me that being diagnosed with cancer is like they got sucked up by a spaceship. And like the aliens were all very friendly and everyone was they had to repeat their name and date of birth about 1 million times. But then they just got beamed down after being in this cancer spaceship and looked around and were trying to tell everyone. And no one, really understands. And also no one wants to hear about it. because cancer survivors not only carry the weight of being diagnosed with cancer and of hearing that diagnosis, but also become the explainers in chief of their disease and really are responsible for being the, the depository of a lot of people's fears about cancer. Because if it can happen to you, then by gosh, it can happen to me.
We're releasing this episode in October, which is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And I think in the last few years, maybe the last decade, there has been some tension about the public understanding of this month, like what it means to like put pink on on your car dealership. Do you know what I mean? And just pink washing. So Can you explain what this is and why there is tension around this phenomenon?
Yes. So women drive healthcare decisions. So in many boardrooms that I've been in many meetings that I've been in, the focus really is marketing to women. So if you can keep women within a healthcare system, you can really keep the whole family in the healthcare system. And women really develop the trust in the healthcare system and in their doctors, and then, bring the children, bring their spouses and partners into the healthcare system. So that capturing something that also makes us feel good, that we are working with capitalism, but it can't just be capitalism because, hey, when you buy that car or go for that test drive, they're going to give $100 to some unknown charity. Or if I have a choice when I'm in the freezer aisle or the yogurt aisle, this always cracks me up with
yogurt. It's always yogurt.
Yes. It's very female-driven products.
Yeah.
And it's really to drive that decision when you're holding two things in your hand. If one, you feel good that it might be helping someone, then you're going to choose that product is sort of where the marketing term goes. But I was just talking to a survivor the other day, and she is a breast cancer survivor and gets so frustrated by October because she said, my work is around the clock, which is prevention and screening. And so I want women to be diagnosed earlier. And the fact that this just wave comes in and then goes out is just so frustrating because it doesn't really talk about what you need to do. It's just this wave of quote unquote breast cancer awareness. And I think women want to move past awareness to action. But I think as a society, we might be a little bit stuck on the awareness part.
So you've gotten really involved in what happens to patients after treatment has concluded. And, we talked about like the beaming down process and how it feels like people are responsible for like narrativizing their disease and that sort of thing. But I also think that there's, and we'll get into this in the questions, like there seems to be such an emphasis on like, oh, you beat cancer. Now are you a normal person? Right? Like there's no follow-up. You never need to have any conversations about what that was like in medical trauma and all that sort of thing too.
Yeah, it's the stiff upper lip, bootstraps approach to cancer treatment. We desperately want, especially women, to be normal. And I work a lot with prostate cancer survivors as well, and their disease is usually not as apparent. So rarely does prostate cancer cause you to lose your hair. But their reluctance to discuss some of the side effects that can happen after prostate cancer treatment, specifically as it relates to erectile dysfunction, can really be limiting in spreading the word about, I have had prostate cancer treatment. This is what happened to me. And these are the results of my treatment. And that secrecy and shame is something that we as a society, we institutionalize our sick, right? So they don't live among us. And when patients come in the first time and we're seeing them in a multidisciplinary setting where they meet with all the doctors who are going to be taking care of them, one of the first questions women ask is, am I going to lose my hair?
Yeah.
And I think that is because we are still very animalistic in our culture that we see different as bad or different as somebody who needs our help. And I can't tell you the number of times that I have been in a group setting where someone has announced that his or her wife or sister or friend has been diagnosed with breast cancer. And the immediate words out of a very well-meaning, kind person's mouth are, oh, well, so-and-so got cancer and died like 2 days later, like crazy. Or even worse, like so-and-so's brother's girlfriend's aunt's dog got cancer and, they gave him one treatment and they died before the treatment was over. And it's a very knee-jerk reaction, but it just goes to show that in these patients, when you hear the word cancer, patients are now responsible for not only input of the information that they're trying to learn a whole new medical language. For anyone who's been in a hospital and heard doctors speak, like trying to figure out what we're saying half the time. And then they ask, do you have any questions? Is like, can you start at the beginning? So these patients are not only learning this new language of cancer, but then they're fending off people's reactions to cancer or explaining reactions to cancer. I've been in grocery stores where I've seen someone walk up to a woman who has a bald head, clearly from chemotherapy, and it could be from a variety. It could be from alopecia, not even related to cancer, and say, I went through cancer treatment and this XYZ supplement helped me. Here's the information about it.
No.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you look around, it's similar, I think, to my friends. I've never had children of my own, but it's my friends who are pregnant. And it's that pregnant belly that sort of like tells people what's going on in your lives. And people think that's like an invitation to come in and like tell their worst birth story.
The way that people respond to cancer news to me is always more indicative of this weird vacuum that we have. And also the focus on hair. It reminds me of like Little Women, how when, who is it who loses her hair? Joe, right? And they're like, and one of Amy says like, Joe, you're one beauty, right? It's like this, this prospect of losing your identity as a woman through like one of the primary signifiers of femininity. But also, I saw this in the discourse after the release of Kate Middleton's post-chemo video. I saw it in the comments to our own newsletter. So many people saying, well, what's going on with the hair? Like, why are they focusing on the hair? And again, these people were not malicious. It was more a confusion, right? Or didn't understand that you don't always lose your hair. And also people have all sorts of ways that they deal with hair loss. And I just think it's a response to not knowing how to respond.
100%. If I could do a PSA right after the how to buckle yourself into an airplane seat and get the oxygen mask down and put yours on before helping a person next to you, it would be appropriate ways to respond to someone who announces that they have cancer. And it does not include the words. So listeners, write these down and like banish them from your vocabulary. God never gives you more than you can handle.
No. Things happen for a reason.
Everything happens for a reason. Great book by Kate Bowler, who's a divinity professor here in North Carolina at Duke University, and great podcast too. She really talks about, I'm sorry, can you please talk to me about what is good about being a 30-ish-year-old mother with metastatic colon cancer? Please. And I'm a divinity scholar, so I would love to know God's purpose. But again, I think you're right, Anne. We don't know what to say. And in the absence of that, I really have tried hard to tell patients that depending on how snarky you want to be, that you could just say, thank you for caring, and try as much as you can just to understand that person, even if they're trying to shove like, I don't know, asparagus juice at you, like in the gallons.
Gross.
There was a whole thing about asparagus a couple of years ago, and so many patients were coming in like, how much asparagus can I eat? I'm like, well, I guess as much as you can tolerate, but so it goes around. It's the same to sugar feed cancer. So there's all this information that's coming at patients, and everybody wants the best for you. And it's wonderful because you don't want somebody to be like, oh, so what? You have cancer. Best of luck to you. It's good. Like, they want to help you. But sifting through those reactions, which are a lot out of fear, again, because many patients now are diagnosed with asymptomatic cancer. So, quote unquote, I felt fine. And then I was diagnosed with the big C. So they walk among us. And it's also fear of this could happen to me and wow, I really care about you, and I don't know how to tell you I care about you. We're really
Yeah.
bad about telling people I care about you when you're going through
Right.
something hard. We just want to go in and fix it.
And as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in our questions, like people in the US specifically are very bad at talking about death. And so
Yes, yes,
the panic talking is one way that we don't talk about death.
for sure. I have a good friend whose daughter recently died of a rare cancer, and she has entered the space where no one knows what to say. And all she desperately wants to do is talk about her daughter. And yet everyone feels like they don't want to bring it up because they
Yep.
don't want to talk about her. They don't want to bring up these hard feelings. And she's like, I've got a hole in my chest the size of the universe. You can't, we underestimate how much we can fill that hole of sadness and of loss. And we just start throwing things in, hoping that that hole will close. But really, all of us have experienced loss, and it's just really hard to do, and it's not on us. So it's very complicated.
Okay, so let's talk about our questions, which are very good and very complicated. This first one comes from Heather.
Where does the prevailing language of battle about cancer come from and when? People die after a long battle with cancer, etc. I have cancer, multiple myeloma, and I never use this terminology. I much prefer imagining I am in a new sort of dialogue or conversation with my body, rather than in a battle with it or with its disease.
So, when does this first start popping up?
Americans love a war metaphor. We love a war on drugs, a war on poverty. In 1971, Nixon declared a war on cancer, and it really also, we love a hero. We love a hero story. I mean, it's a hero's quest, right? That's so pervasive in modern writing and literature and culture and in the past as well. In America, the concept of a war on cancer really started in the intra-war period in the 20s and 30s. And the precursor to the American Cancer Society was called the American Society for Control of Cancer. And they formed what was called a Women's Field Army in 1936. And the stated goal of the Women's Field Army was to promote trench warfare. This is a quote, promote trench warfare with a vengeance against a ruthless killer. So for $1, women joined, they got a brown uniform, and there was a vertical organization structure where they were given a rank in this field army. They had a little insignia with their rank on their chest. And by 1945, there were somewhere between 500 and 700,000 members across America. And the goal was to educate white middle-class women on how they can prevent and detect early cancers. So most cancer was thought to affect women because we didn't know about prostate cancer, and we weren't really invading into bodies yet to do things like colon cancer. So the visible cancers were female cancers, breast cancer, and uterine and cervical cancer. And this pervasive notion really caught the American psyche because we just won World War II, and we were just obsessed with, we wanted to fight something. And so this war mentality really started at that point. And I think in a way, it's difficult to extract it from the cancer experience because cancer has always been with us. Unlike diseases that come and go like HIV or COVID or polio or tuberculosis, even type 2 diabetes, cancer has been with us since the ancient Egyptians, and even further back in ancient China, we're documenting cases of cancer. So how we deal with this pervasive presence in our lives is really dictated by the culture surrounding when we start to pay attention. So that's, I think, where the war on cancer started. And at that point, we had all these surgeons returning from the war who had seen horrific injuries. But we had trained a bunch of war-tested surgeons, and we'd also discovered things like antibiotics. And we could now put people to sleep with anesthesia. So we could do heroic surgeries and people could survive. So if you put it against a war, then you also train the psyche of the culture to accept these very radical, disfiguring, and awful treatments. And I think somewhat that despite the fact that cancer treatment has become much, much less radical, and through the development of supportive care tools like anti-nausea medications and IV fluids and that sort of thing has become somewhat more palatable in some diseases, that battle hero duality continues.
It also strikes me that like there's something about like how chemo is paced or radiation treatment is paced. It's like, okay, it's like running a marathon, right? You're like, you have it on your calendar. And like on this day, I go into this battle. And then I have recovery from that battle. And my team is there to support me. You know, people talk about their cancer team in terms of both their doctors, but also their support system. Like it is like a 100K race. It's even long. It's much longer than a marathon. And what it does to the body too.
Yes. And it doesn't give space to recovery and living with cancer. So for this person from Heather with a disease like multiple myeloma, that's living with cancer. And that's a whole new concept that is sometimes hard for people to discuss and hard to educate their friends and family around, because people want you to either be cured or dead.
Yes.
And it's, which are you? Well, you still have cancer, but you look fine and you're going to work. And that our minds really haven't wrapped around this new state of living with cancer. It doesn't fit well in this war mentality.
I've been educated a lot by a friend of mine who's been living with stage 4 for 4 years now. And she actually just recently mapped out, because so many people had asked her, she was like, okay, I'm going to map out everything in my Instagram stories and save it as a pinned story. The dozens of rounds of chemo that she has been through. Like right now, she's off chemo in order to get her tumors large enough so that she can be considered as part of a study. But like what it means to take a chemo break and why you have to do that. And essentially just like, what is the reality of trying to live as long as I possibly can and enjoy my life too, right? She's like, I don't want to be in battle all the time. Who wants to live their life that way?
Yeah, that's very true. And the enemy changes, right? So that's why we change treatments, is this thing that we call cancer. I mean, if you think cancer, comes from the word crab, that it's really like invading into our bodies in a very, terrible way. But really, it's these cells that are part of us floating through our bodies and really have become radicalized against us. And so those cells are not, one treatment will knock down, if we don't cure the disease, one treatment knocks down all the dumb cells and then all the smart cells are left and then they grow. And then we knock down the smart cells, but then there's even smarter cells. So that's why our treatments have to become usually progressively more invasive and aggressive, because we're still trapped in a mentality that started in the 1970s, which is where the podcast starts as well, which is finding the magic bullet to cancer. Going back to the vaccines, we found penicillin. I mean, we can cure polio. We can, prevent people from dying of infections. Cancer, please, we'll have that done, in 10 years. And we really got into a cul-de-sac with the amazing and early success of the cure of childhood leukemia and adult lymphomas, which are only about 15 to 20% of cancers. And unfortunately, for the past 50 years, instead of understanding what makes these cells that are a part of us different, we've just been trying to find the perfect poison. So how much poison can we give the human that doesn't kill the human, but kills these cells that come from the human? And titrating that has really been, I think, led us to this place where people are frustrated, and we're just opening the door to this is the hope that I really have for this next generation, is we're finally opening the door to more specific treatments for cancer.
Okay, this is actually a great setup for our next question, and it's about the way that, again, we talk about cancer. This is from Anjali.
I hate that we speak about cancer as a single entity. I'm thinking of Biden talking about ending cancer, which isn't really possible. First of all, because gene mutations happen all the time, but also because not all cancers are the same, either medically or socially. As someone who had a relatively chill cancer, common among young women, pretty easily resolved with surgery, asymptomatic and discovered by chance, whose treatment was actually more disruptive than the cancer itself: surgery on my neck, super visible scar, lifelong medication to supplement the hormones I need but no longer make enough of, susceptible to a host of other medical problems now, etc. I have never felt like I can claim being a cancer survivor. It's like I didn't suffer in the way we expect people who have cancer to suffer. When I hear stats about how common cancer is among younger people, it takes me a few minutes to remember that I am included in that stat. I guess I'm more curious about how we think about the unacknowledged hierarchies in cancer and disability in general, the politics of visible suffering, and what that compels others to do or not do in terms of offering care. Like, my health is actually worse after the treatment than before. Most people in my life don't see that, and I wonder how much of that is related to the fact that I didn't have a stereotypical illness journey. I didn't inhabit the sick role in ways people expect, so now the longer tail of illness is obscured.
All right, there's a lot there, and I'm really glad we have this question. So let's start with the first part, which is about ending cancer or finding a cure. So what does that kind of thinking just misunderstand?
So President Biden is not the first person to use the word cancer moonshot. That was actually a term coined by Mary Lasker, who was an amazing philanthropist and New York socialite. I had a guest post by Judy Peterson, who wrote her biography recently on cancer culture. And she was very frustrated in the 1970s because she felt like there was too much going into the basic understanding of cancer. She said, I don't want petri dishes, I want pills. And so she really swung the American Cancer Society, as well as the whole of government, into finding a cure for cancer. And that really has been the trajectory that we have been on until recently. So the frustration in the mindset of cancer as a solitary disease really comes from the past 50 years of how we understood it. I think that now we are understanding with CRISPR technology and more work on the different mutations and the targeting of mutations that are different for each cancer, as well as learning, why does my grandmother smoke 2 packs a day and ate, bacon, eggs, and 3 pieces of toast with butter and lived till she was 100, never got cancer, whereas someone who never smoked dies of lung cancer? Why is that? And what we understand is there's host factors, there's environmental factors, and that in combination with the cancer cells really determines how cancer forms and how we should treat it. And to understand that cancer is a disease of an organism as well as a disease of a community and a system is really important.
So, okay, second part of the question, where Anjali says she doesn't feel like she can claim being a cancer survivor because she didn't have the legible suffering that matches societal expectations. Do you hear this a lot?
I do, yeah, especially from young people with cancer. And yeah. Anjali, this is Dr. Wentworth. I'm hereby giving you your cancer card. So you could just say, if anybody questions your cancer cred, you can say, I got my cancer card from Dr. Wentworth. I wrote one of my first posts on cancer culture was right after the Barbie movie came out. And if you remember that scene at the beginning where she's dancing and the music screeches to a halt because she says, do you guys ever think about death? And we and the other Barbies and even the DJ knows that Barbie's not supposed to be asking that question. That's not how Barbie's supposed to act. So, and again, getting back to Kate Middleton and that gauzy video of a cancer survivor, we really have this concept of what a cancer survivor is supposed to look like. And we really want everyone to fit in that description of what we think is a cancer survivor. A little bit, you're too healthy to have cancer, or you don't fit into my expectation of what a cancer survivor looks like. I'll tell you, I've been living in the 1970s as part of this podcast. And in the early 1970s, there were 3 movies that were released right in a row that depicted cancer. The first was called Love Story, and it starred Ryan O'Neal. Do you know this?
Of course.
Are you crying right now? Are you crying?
Yes. It's yes. I mean, the hold of that movie on an entire generation cannot be overstated.
Correct. But did you know, Anne, in that movie, the words cancer and leukemia are never mentioned, even though that's what Ally McGraw dies of.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah. Second movie, Robert De Niro in Bang the Drum Slowly. He plays a baseball player who hides his diagnosis from his teammates, who actually hire a private investigator to see where he's going. He also dies in that movie. He has Hodgkin's lymphoma. And then, of course, the ABC movie of the week, Brian's Song, where a dying Brian Piccolo holds his wife's hand and while breathlessly repeating, "Who'd you believe it, Joy? Who'd ever believe it?" When in actuality, if you talk to his wife, his death was miserable and horrifying and painful and terrible. And there was an Esquire magazine article that interviewed the president of the American Cancer Society right after all these movies came out. And this is the quote that I love. And he said, "If you portray cancer on the screen with all its degradation and pain, you haven't a prayer. If these people ever walked into a cancer ward, they'd run away so fast. And we want people to stop running around from this goddamn disease."
So basically, like, if we make cancer look like not a big deal, then people will get treated if they think they have cancer.
Guess.
I think that, at least in my life, like, people all the time are like, "Do I have cancer?" Right? Because, like, they have no understanding of, like anything that feels off with their body, like, "Oh no, I have cancer," just like manically going down Google bad rabbit holes and like, I definitely have cancer, right?
100%. And it's so, if you even look at our modern movies, Stepmom, The Bucket List.
Yes.
The Fault in Our Stars.
What's the one that I was just thinking of? It has My Life. It has Nicole Kidman and Michael Keaton, and I watched that at, like, I don't know, I was in 7th or 8th grade, and I cried so hard, and I was like, "This is what happens. This is what cancer does," right? Like, and that's how it cements these narratives in our heads.
But it's necessary in all of those stories that people die.
Yes,
They suffer, they die, and their loved ones are left to grieve. And
Walk to Remember. Sorry, just Walk to Remember.
Yes.
Also,
Yes. You can go on forever.
Well, it's melodrama, right? Like, you have to have that narrative of suffering and then, like, a death that then clarifies things for the people who lived.
And it has to mean something. Like, cancer has to mean something.
Yes. Totally.
And if you didn't suffer enough, according to our culture, and this is how we come to these feelings. And the great thing is we can change it because we created the culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of where Anjali is coming from, is this, you are feeling the correct feelings that the culture is feeding you. We expect cancer to mean something. And of course, nothing means anything unless you've really suffered and, in the case of Hollywood, died.
Well, and like, that, like, if you haven't been beatified, like, through the process of cancer, like, if it hasn't made you into a saint, then somehow you did cancer wrong. Right?
100%. I had another patient I was talking to, and patients will always apologize. They'll start crying in the exam room and they will say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for crying." And I'm like, "What? I don't care. You're paying me to sit here. You can cry. This is a safe place to cry."
Also, this sucks. You're like
100%. Yes. You don't have to be quote unquote strong for me. I mean, you may have to for what you face and what people need you to do outside this exam room. But girl, sit here and cry. Like, here's some tissues. Like, completely lose it. Let me call, like, one of our social workers or one of our counselors who can help you kind of work through this grief that you're feeling, which is completely normal. But this is normal. Step down off the pedestal. It's not very fun up there. Come down off the pedestal, just like Barbie, you know, her feet flattened. Like, what would happen if we flattened the feet of all of our cancer survivors and let them kind of just be broken people for a while? I think it'd be okay.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing, I mean, this is something that always happens with narrative, right? Is it ends, right? So, like, you don't get to see what happens to the family 2 years after the death of this loved one, right? Unless it's like a very slight coda. And what Anjali is pointing to is, like, actually, like, my life after this treatment is much more difficult than during it. She points to the overlap with some discussions that we have about disability and, like, how people are ill-equipped to talk about, essentially, like, this is a chronic illness that she's going to manage for the rest of her life, even though the cancer itself is gone.
Yeah, there was a recent, there's just a paper that's been out. I haven't even had a chance to read it yet. But the through line or the main takeaway was that 40% of cancer patients have chronic disabilities as a result of their cancer treatment. And they also have a higher rate of non-cancer death because of the side effects of the treatments that we give them. So higher rates of heart disease and lung disease and all this other stuff, as well as secondary cancers caused by our treatments. So there's also a big return to work movement. So often patients will say, like, when should I return to work? And, disability, long-term and short-term disability only provides a certain percentage of salary. If you're even fortunate enough to have a job that offers that, I've had many patients return to work and suddenly their position is terminated. Everyone was very happy to support them, quote unquote, when they got cancer. But now you've been gone just a little bit too long and we hired so-and-so, So first of all, I always tell patients, take advantage of any FMLA. I will fill out any paper. I will sign, any form that documents your illness because it is really important to have the protection. Everyone, I think you'd have to be a real jerk to be mean to someone diagnosed with cancer, but that feeling tends to fade over time. And I've just seen patients burn too many times. So taking advantage of the protections that we fought so hard to provide for people going through illness in our society, if you have them, talk to human resources and take advantage of them.
Yeah. This next question goes in a very different direction, but I think it's going to allow us to talk about some interesting things. So this is about the specific kind of help and resources that people are seeking out. This comes from Caitlin.
Why are cancer support Facebook groups so insane? Is it desperation? Is it an older generation not knowing how to vet information from the internet? I've found they're full of quackery and desperate people seeking impossible cures.
Well, to me, this is just like lack of faith in the medical establishment, also just distrust of like there's a lot of medical anxiety. Just it's much more cultural than just like cancer groups. Like this is in all sorts of groups for people who are dealing with illness.
Yes, as the culture expert, would you like to talk about Facebook in general, Anne?
Well, I just think that like a Facebook group is a place where you have this sense of intimacy because you are spending time there, but also removed. So even though it's your real name or something close to your real name, it still is with people that you haven't met. But people who are often, a lot of these Facebook groups are pretty granular, like a specific type of cancer, or you're a parent to someone with a specific type of cancer or a partner. And so what do you do with all of the fear and anxiety that you can't express with other people in your life? Maybe with the person who has the cancer, maybe like you have the cancer and you just feel like you're burdening everyone else. Yeah. All of that excess goes into the Facebook group. So it is just a space of excess emotion. To me, it is an indication not that people are crazy. It's an indication that people are suffering.
That's perfectly said, Anne. I think it's easily accessible. And when we don't allow these conversations to happen in public and we don't allow people to be broken in public, then humans are going to find community. And I will say for patients with rare diseases, I have not seen any successful implementation for support for people with rare diseases like these Facebook groups. Yep. And for patients with really, really rare cancers, they have just told me over and over again, and often are educating us because they're communicating with people that have been around the world for different second opinions. Right. That has been such a powerful positive. So I'll kind of again couch this into how this culture was created. If you think back to the 1800s, the gap between I'm going to call them physicians, but really they were kind of like the local healer kind of. Yeah. The gap between what that person knew and the patient knew was very narrow. So everybody knew, quote unquote, that hemlock was a treatment for many things or leeches were a treatment for many things. So you just went down to the local river, picked some hemlock and got some leeches. And, it was a very narrow gap. But then again, with the invention of antiseptic technique, of antibiotics, of microscopes, of anesthesia, the gap between the patient and the mostly all-knowing male physician became wider. And then we started to see things like the thalidomide scandal, and the trust in that all-knowing healer really started to degrade. And with the democratization of information with the internet, I think the information is there. It's just the application of that information. So what do you do with the information? And in patients that are desperately looking for answers, I think they have the information, but what to do with that information is sort of where medicine comes back in. Not again as the all-knowing healer, but just hey, I have training to help you make a decision on what your best course of action, given this particular narrow diagnosis, is.
Yeah. I also think there's so much complication in talking about placebo, because like if something works for someone and makes them feel better, it can be really insulting to be like, oh, that's the placebo effect, right?
Yeah.
Like you're just making that up in your head that makes you feel better. But also that's often, people are using this as like, this will also work for you because it worked for me.
Correct.
When it's probably a complicated melange of psychosomatic stuff going on, and maybe stuff with your body too, and maybe stuff with like what's working in your body at a certain moment. But that we're so ill-equipped to talk about that in any good way.
We also are looking for trusted sources. And when you're diagnosed with cancer, you rally. I've seen amazing things happen. Families come back together. I've seen the opposite, but a lot of times everybody rallies around someone who is diagnosed with cancer. And those are your trusted people. Like my mom thinks I'm a wonderful doctor, but like the person walking in for the first time is like, doesn't know me from Adam's house cat, So right. Physicians undergo 4 years of college. This is me, 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and 5 years of training. So I was in training for 13 years. Each hospital I apply to privileges for, I have to list every hospital I've ever worked at. I have to give my case numbers for the past 3 to 5 years. I have to have a report from my malpractice carrier, 3 to 6 letters of reference from friends, coworkers, other physicians. And that's why it's called privileges, because it's a privilege to care for patients. Right. So I think when you're looking for sources of information, there's people who care about you, and then there's expertise. And taking those two equally important sources of information and lining up what you can look in the mirror and say is the right treatment for you is really the best way to proceed forward with your care.
Yeah. We could talk about this for like another hour, but we should go on to the next question. So I write so much about friendship and community, and we often talk about like, how can you actually help someone who is going through a crisis? Like, how can you show up for someone? And this is going to be our AAA segment today. So if you want advice on showing up for a friend in crisis, head over to culturestudypod.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. Okay, so where can people find you on the internet if they want to hear more from you?
Sure. Well, first of all, subscribe to Less Radical. You can do that on any podcast platform or via my Substack, which is Cancer Culture.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show today. This was like such a pleasure. I loved it.
Thanks, Anne. Longtime follower. So impressed. So honored to be with you, Anne.